joining in. We'll be at Acts chapter number 2, and we're going to be starting around verse 14 and try to get through about verse 24 today. So we're got just a few here in the room, but thank y'all online for joining. There's Rusty. I see him on there. Good to see you, buddy. And we're going to be starting off again with verse 14. So what we've seen so far in our lesson is we took off last week because I wasn't here. We were in Florida. But the week before, we looked at the day of Pentecost and how they began to speak in tongues and how they were able to communicate with as many as 18 different nationalities. The context seemed to be that they were just speaking either in their own language, that they were native as Galileans, and others were hearing them in their own language. So like I would be speaking in English, and others would be hearing in Japanese or Chinese or German, or whatever the case may be. Is either that was a situation, or they were speaking some type of heavenly language, some people have described it as, and everyone was simply hearing it in their own native tongue. We're not exactly sure the context, but I'm very positive it was one or the other. So that was a new thing for the disciples, and the response was, we see in verse number 12, the response was that everyone was amazed, that some doubted, and they all asked each other, "What meaneth this?" And then some mocked and said, "These men are full of new wine." So that was the response of the people standing by and watching. They thought these people must be drunk, but that obviously didn't explain what was going on. Because what was going on is people were hearing in their own language what these people were saying, even though they were speaking a different language. There's no way that being full of alcohol would cause that sort of reaction or event, result, I guess is the word I'm looking for. So verse 14, we see Peter's response. So Peter says, standing up with the 11, lifted his voice and said to them, "Ye men of Judah, and all ye that dwell at Jerusalem, be this known unto you, and hearken unto my words. For these are not drunken, as ye suppose, seeing it is but the third hour of the day." Of course, the Jewish culture is the day begins at 6 a.m., so that means it's 9 a.m. at this point. And then he goes into referencing some Old Testament prophetical passages, and that's what we're going to dig into today. It says, "But this is that which was spoken by the prophet Joel." I love how he phrases that. He says this, because I'm sure he probably had a hard time explaining this himself, of what exactly was going on. So he was just saying, this is that which was spoken by the prophet Joel. So if we go to Joel, there's several places that we can reference, and I'm going to go back and kind of hit those for us. I've got several places marked, and we'll read Joel's reference last. I'm going to go back and hit some of the others that tie into this as well. What we're going to look at first is Isaiah 44 and verse number 3. I'm actually going to read the first few verses here. So what Peter is explaining here is this is what has been discussed all these years. So going back as far as Isaiah, you're looking at 750 years before Christ. When we look at Joel, that was about 100 years later, so it's about 650 years before Christ. And for these hundreds of years, these prophecies have been out there. And this is one of them. It says in chapter 44 of the book of Isaiah, "Yet now hear, O Jacob my servant, and Israel, whom I have chosen. Thus saith the Lord that made thee and formed thee from the womb. There's a good pro-life verse. Which will help thee. Fear not, O Jacob, my servant, and thou Ch2, whom I have chosen. For I'll go back to that word here in a second. For I will pour water upon him that is thirsty, and floods upon the dry ground. I will pour my spirit upon thy seed, and my blessing upon thine offspring. So he's speaking here of people who he is endeared to. Jacob, his servant. He's also talking to the nation of Israel here. And in verse 2, that word Ch2 is a term of endearment. My study note says it may be related to the Hebrew word yashar, which means virtuous. So he's speaking to people he truly cares about. He's speaking to, obviously, to his own people. And this is what he says. He says, I will pour out water upon him that is thirsty, and floods upon the dry ground. I will pour my spirit upon thy seed. And that's significant. We, as believers today, we are Gentiles, but we have been, as the New Testament describes, grafted in to the family of God, which are the Jews. So we have the same inheritance as the Jews have. So the Jews directly, which is who all the disciples were. Jesus was a Jew. Peter was a Jew. Many of the disciples were Jews. Not all, but many. And it says that his seed would have God's Spirit poured out upon them and God's blessing upon thine offspring. So this moment in Acts chapter 2 is going back to this passage of Scripture of fulfilling it. So we have that in Isaiah. We also have Ezekiel chapter number 11, verse 19 says, I will give them one heart and will put a new spirit within you. I will take the stony heart out of their flesh and will give them a heart of flesh. Now, verse 19, my study notes say that the stony heart is that of the unregenerate, someone who has not yet believed, who refused to submit to the will of God. The hard-hearted is who is referring to. The radical, supernatural, spiritual transformation of people and the associated physical blessings promised in this and other prophecies of the new covenant will take place in the future messianic age from this verse. And of course that occurred here at the day of Pentecost. So the day of Pentecost is fulfilling a lot of these Old Testament scriptures. If we look at Joel, which is what Peter's actually quoting here, it says, but this is that which was spoken by the prophet Joel, and it shall come to pass in the last days. So here's where he's quoting the scripture, and this is Joel chapter 2, around verse 28 and 29. But this is what Peter says. It shall come to pass in the last days, saith God, I will pour out of my spirit upon all flesh, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, and your young men shall see visions, and your old men shall dream dreams. And on my servants and on my handmaidens I will pour out in those days of my spirit, he mentions that again, and they shall prophesy. And I will show wonders in heaven above, and signs in the earth beneath, blood and fire and vapor of smoke. The sun shall be turned into darkness, and the moon into blood, before that great and notable day of the Lord comes. Starts to sound a little crazy and scary. And it shall come to pass that whosoever shall call on the name of the Lord shall be saved. So if we go back and look at that in Joel, this is exactly what Joel said. Joel chapter number 2. This is basically verses 28 down to verse 32, closing out the chapter of Joel 2. It says, it shall come to pass afterward that I will pour out my spirit upon all flesh, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, your old men shall dream dreams, your young men shall see visions, and also upon thy servants and upon the handmaidens in those days I will pour out my spirit. And I will show wonders in the heavens and in the earth, blood and fire and pillars of smoke. The sun shall be turned into darkness, and the moon into blood, before the great and the terrible day of the Lord come. And it shall come to pass that whosoever shall call on the name of the Lord shall be delivered. For in Mount Zion and in Jerusalem shall be delivered, as the Lord has said, and in the remnant whom the Lord shall call. Of course, that includes us as Gentiles there in that last piece. But he's kind of speaking of several different things here. So obviously, verse 28, where he says that he'll pour out his Spirit upon all flesh, and you'll see visions and prophesy and dream dreams. Those are the things that began to occur in Acts chapter number 2. So on the day of Pentecost, that occurred. So to us, that was almost 2,000 years ago. So if we take 2022, subtract 33 years from it, whatever that math is, that's, what is that, 1989? 1,989 years. So almost 2,000 years. I'm anxious to see if anything will happen in 2033. I think if that's the exact age, we don't know precisely. That's how old Jesus was. But somewhere around that time, I don't know. I have a feeling something big might happen. I don't know. I apologize for the technical issues there. But where I was at, to recast, I'm not sure where it cut out. What we see in the fulfillment of Joel chapter number 2. So what Peter is quoting, again, is Joel chapter number 2. And he's quoted verses 28 really down to verse number 32. But specifically, we see in verse 28 that God, through Joel, prophesied that his Spirit would be poured out upon all flesh. Your daughters will prophesy, your old men will dream dreams, your young men will see visions. And also the Spirit will be poured out upon the servants and the handmaidens in those days. He says, I will pour out my Spirit. That we see fulfilled already in Acts chapter number 2. Here in verse 30 and 31, where it says, I will show wonders in the heavens, earth, and in the earth, blood and fire, pillars of smoke, and the sun shall be turned into darkness, the moon into blood, before the great and terrible day of the Lord come. Have you seen that come to pass yet? No, I have not seen that come to pass. And he quotes it, Peter quotes it in verses 19 and 20. He says, I will show wonders in the heaven above and signs in the earth beneath, blood and fire and vapor of smoke. The sun shall be turned into darkness, the moon into blood, before that great and notable day of the Lord. Now we did see the sun turn into darkness for a period of time during the crucifixion. So we know that was the case. But I believe, and Greg's joining us, you may have some insight as you're walking blindly into this conversation. We're talking in Acts chapter 2, where Peter is quoting Joel chapter 2. And he says that he's talking about a prophecy hundreds of years before Christ came, where he says he'll pour out his Spirit basically upon everyone, and all this wild stuff will begin to occur. And verse 18, he says, on my servants and on my handmaidens I'll pour out in those days my Spirit, and they will prophesy. Here's where we're at. It says, I will show wonders in heaven above and signs in the earth below, or earth beneath, blood and fire and vapor of smoke. The sun shall be turned into darkness, the moon into blood, before that great and notable day of the Lord come. So far we're in agreement that the Holy Spirit was poured out on the day of Pentecost. Mm-hmm. And a lot of amazing things began to occur. People were seeing visions and dreams, and they were speaking in tongues, and we definitely saw the Spirit of God poured out upon mankind, all who would receive. Where we're at now is, have we seen these other things occur yet? Of the blood and the fire and the vapor of smoke and the sun being turned to darkness and the moon to blood. Have we seen all of those things occur?
Well,
Of course, the harvest moons and stuff.
Right.
All blood
They've had the
moons,
blood
you know.
moons.
And that's where it gets a little gray. You know, we're like, well, we do have blood moons.
yeah,
The sun was turned to darkness on the day of the crucifixion
right.
for 3 hours, I think it was.
But this was said after, so this was after Pentecost, right?
Right. This is
So
after
that
Pentecost.
would have already happened.
Correct. So Peter does seem to be implying, from this point moving forward, is what I'm referring to.
Mhm.
And he's quoting Joel chapter 2, which again was 650 years before Christ. When we read some other passages in Isaiah and Ezekiel that talked about how God would bless the seed of Israel and pour out his spirit upon his people, which again we believe occurred in Acts chapter 2. So we're looking at these other signs and wonders. I don't think they've occurred yet. I mean, we have hints of maybe just reminders that it will occur. I don't know. I mean, it's kind of interesting to study the blood moons. And, there was a book written, what was his name? Hagee was his last name.
Yeah.
John Hagee, I think. The
My
Blood
mom-
Moon.
my mom
She has the
And-
book, she gave it to her.
Yeah, and we went through his book in a church I pastored in North Carolina. And everybody's like, oh, it was September 19th of some year that everything's going to end and all. And it was the super blood moon at the Feast of Tabernacles. There's several in a row. This was the biggest one ever. The Jews were out on the hill or the field, a hillside below the moon, and their little tabernacle things that there. And he was like, "This is going to be it." And of course, here still we are. 10 years later. But I think we have these things just as reminders. It's kind of like the rainbow. Every time I see a rainbow, I'm not all like, "Yay, Pride Month." That's not what the rainbow's about, right? It's totally contrary to that. It's not the celebration of what we've done. It's a celebration of what God has refused to do ever since. If we read the true context of the promise of the reminder of the rainbow, is there's really two parts of it. One, to never destroy the earth again with a flood, and two, it basically ended the cursing of the ground. If you read that, and we farm now, we get things from the ground. It's not quite as cursed as it seemed to be when he said the ground will be cursed and you have to work all year. Of course, we're still working, right? But the rainbow is a reminder of God's provision and God's promises. I think these blood moons and things of those natures are reminders of what is to come. I don't know. How do you feel about that? Do you think the blood will literally turn the moon will literally turn to blood one day? Or will it just appear? Will it be I kind of wonder if it's the moment Peter talks about where everything will melt with fervent heat, maybe building up to that point. And that's how God's going to destroy, it says the heavens and the earth. There's a new heaven and a new earth, and the former things are passed away. I don't know if that ties into it. I definitely know. I feel it's a future event.
I agree. And when you were saying that earlier, my head was what's going on in Ukraine and how nuclear is coming up.
Sure.
Who knows if it'll blot out the sun, with what I was, I don't know. That's where my head went at first.
Right.
I don't know that I'm convinced on that. It's just.
And there's I need to look this up quickly.
So is the new heaven brought down to earth? So how would you get rid of earth unless you recreated it with the new heaven?
Right. That's a big
Yeah.
question. And we'll get into that when we get later on down the road, I guess. But I'm looking for something that a buddy of mine shared with me, Rusty. I was mentioning him a minute ago. Trying to remember what it's called. It's some type of a science project, basically, that they are doing in, I think it's Switzerland. It's called, I can't think of it. It'll come to me. The Hadron Collider.
Oh yeah.
You heard of this? So the Hadron Collider it's basically the giant science experiment.
And it actually, they
yes,
did it.
yes,
And it didn't blow the world up.
right, and it's but it supposedly it has unleashed something. Like they've discovered what they're calling dark matter or antimatter is where this stuff is coming from in the conversation. I was listening to a pastor preach on it, and it seems to have almost like tapped into the spiritual world, and people who are messing with this stuff, they took a sample of what they discovered or created in the process of whatever they're doing to some university, and people were like losing their mind or going insane, and they all attribute it to this material that has been generated from their efforts. They feel like it's almost like unleashed something, or like it's tapping into what is discussed in Revelation, where the demons are released from wherever they are, kind of thing. And they feel that if you watch the opening ceremony for the opening of that facility, there were a lot of demonic depictions. There was a guy dressed in a goat, all these evil spirits dancing around, and all this crazy satanic symbolism in the little procession that occurred before they opened the thing. So it's like they're aware of this and kind of intended on this to be some type of a satanic earthly or worldly thing or something. I don't know. And you don't hear a lot about all that sort of stuff, but it's all out there on YouTube if you want to pull up the ceremony of it. But I kind of wonder if it's not, they say that, I should have studied more on it before I started talking about it, but the material is called antimatter. The material that they have mined, they say that I think it's 1 gram of it is equivalent to 4 of the bombs that we dropped on Hiroshima. And so, yeah, I'm kind of thinking some of that sort of stuff that they're tinkering with, the nuclear war capability that's coming up, if all that may not at least be utilized. I was talking to my buddy about it, and I was like, God uses us to accomplish what he needs to do. He used Judas to turn Jesus over to the Jews. He used the Romans to crucify Christ to fulfill the purpose in which he came. He used Pharaoh, in a way, to release his people through the plagues that had to be brought upon. Of course, he used Moses to do all that. So he uses us and the things that we come up with to accomplish his will. So I kind of wonder if this Hadron Collider isn't something that will be used by the Antichrist to blow up the earth when it's our God will use it. It's just sitting there, and the atheists even say that if this earth tilts a fraction of a degree or gets out of whatever orbit, or there's some type of a ring magnetic field or something, that if it wavers just a tiny bit, that the whole world will blow up. Even atheists are open about this, so that's a scientific thing. So yeah, I kind of wonder if some of the stuff we're doing won't simply be used. I think the Antichrist will most likely be using artificial intelligence and all the systems we're putting in place now. You talk about how how in the world can, back in the even 70s, I've heard older folks who are deceased now used to say, there's no way the book of Revelation is relevant or real, because how in the world how can the whole world see those 2 witnesses die in the streets and then come back alive again? It says the whole world's going to see it. How are they going to see it? Well, it's right here.
Got that right.
We have the technology now. We see the wars going on in Russia. We see everything going on all around the world because we have the technology in place. So that makes the book of Revelation even more relevant, since using the technologies we have come up with. The image that the Antichrist will put in place, and both will speak and people will bow down to it. That could be, humanoid robotics, or it's just some type of artificial intelligence system. I mean, I think all these things are going to be used to usher in things like what we're seeing here of, maybe it will be a big explosion. Maybe it's just the supernatural power of God. Maybe we're reading too much into it. I don't know.
Environmental stuff that's going on.
Yeah, the environmental things that are happening.
No matter where you stand, you got to say something's wrong.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Something's wrong and something's coming. Even within these passages that I'm reading, it talks about the moon and talks about the earth. And I know I preach on this all the time, but nowhere in these passages that I've read in the Bible does it ever talk about Mars or any other planet where humans inhabit it. But Elon Musk's efforts are pushing that to become a reality within the next 30 years. So if he's successful, which everything else he's done pretty much has been successful with, that's alarming to me. It's exciting to me at the same time that we could see all of these things come to pass. We could see the rapture. We could see these events being fulfilled. But I do believe these are future events, that the sun being turned to darkness, the moon into blood. And it does say before that great and notable day of the Lord come. So what day is that referring to? The second coming of Christ. That's the way all my research and studies have pointed to that. All the Old Testament passages. And that's why I said when that Blood Moon's book came out, I'm like, look, all of these things being discussed in this book are after the rapture. They're at least mid, if not towards the tail end of the tribulation period. Based on what I feel the Bible teaches, we're waiting for the rapture before the tribulation hits. I mean, the book of Revelation lays that out. Many other passages lay that out. And for everybody to be running around saying, oh, it's going to be, God's coming back for the second time with this blood moon. Well, if that's the case, then we all missed the boat, according to the teachings of the Bible, because the rapture would have occurred at least 3.5 years. And that's what I told my folks at the church, and some of them didn't like that. But I'm like, if you look at the structure of it, if this is the case, and it's all going to be over in September, or whatever the date was, and this is going to be the second coming of the Lord, then we missed the boat at least 3.5 years ago at the rapture, because we're all still here, sitting here studying these books. But I do believe it's going to be probably a later tribulation period event, if not at the actual end. We do read in Revelation a lot of these things about the moon turning to blood and the sky turning dark and all these creatures being released from hell and going and stinging people and tormenting them, and people wanting to die but not being able to die, and all these crazy things occurring during the tribulation period itself. Sounds kind of similar to some of the stuff we're, seeing happening today, which again I think is just a precursor to leading up to what's going to happen, which I believe to be sooner than later. But I do believe that these passages are talking about future events. And then he kind of closes out the thought, as well as Joel, when he says in verse 32, as he closes out chapter 2 of Joel, it says that it shall come to pass that whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be delivered. For in Mount Zion and in Jerusalem shall be deliverance, as the Lord hath said, and in the remnant of whom the Lord shall call. Again, I believe that's us. That's the Gentiles. That's everyone who responds to Christ. And the way Peter put it, he says, and it shall come to pass that whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. So there's a little bit of difference in terminology, but it's the same concept, I think, being taught there. As Joel closes out, again, this is pretty amazing. 650 years before Peter stood up and said this, he says, the remnant whom the Lord shall call. Peter now describes it. We're standing here now. This is the fulfillment of Joel 2, at least in verses 28 and 29, where the Spirit is poured out upon men. He says that whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved, because now there's a new context. Jesus has already come. Jesus has already died and risen and ascended back to heaven. And so now moving forward, that's how God is going to call them to the cross of Calvary so that they can receive Christ to be their Savior. So that's where he uses the word being saved. So he's definitely talking about, in the first part of his little passage there, look, this is what y'all have known about for close to 700 years now, or maybe 750 years. There's going to be future events that are going to occur. That's going to be really wild. And if you wanted to not fall under the judgment and authority of that judgment from God, you're going to have to get saved. And that's the whole purpose of this moving forward. The reason they were able to speak in tongues is to communicate the message to people even not of their own language. And as they're moving forward, there's warnings of these things to come. There's going to be signs that we see throughout the book of Acts that we don't see today. The prophesying. People still, I guess, see visions and dream dreams. I don't know if it's the same exact context of what he was talking about, because God did speak through dreams and through those visions. Peter has a vision later in the book of Acts where he sees this big sheet coming down with all these animals all over it, and he's in a trance on top of this housetop just looking, and God shows him this vision, and he says, "Rise, kill, and eat, Peter." Peter's like, "Not so, I'm Jewish, I can't eat all those animals." He says, "Don't call what I've ordained as unclean. Rise, kill, and eat." And he gave him a vision. And moving forward, that's why we now can enjoy our hot dogs and hamburgers and and barbecue and all that other good stuff that the Jews still won't participate in, right? So more for us, I guess. But that's what Peter is saying, is that here you're going to see some amazing things happening moving forward. You're going to see some scary things happening in the future, which we still yet to have seen, as far as I can understand this. And if you want to be on God's side, you're going to have to call upon the name of the Lord, which is what Paul tells us in the book of Romans as well. So let's kind of close out down to verse 24 today. We got about 15 minutes. And it says, "Ye men of Israel." So this is what has happened. And we've had tons of technical difficulties today. You were out of the room for that. The thing quit working. We're back on. So to try to summarize for everybody's sake, we started in verse 14. He stood up and he said, "These people aren't drunk. This is an act of God." This is the fulfillment of what Joel said, in that as of now, we're seeing these things happening of a move from God. In the future, we're going to see some bad things happening as condemnation and judgment upon the earth from God. You need to get saved. He quotes Joel to make the point, and then he says, Ye men of Israel, hear these words. Jesus of Nazareth, a man approved of God, among you by miracles and wonders and signs, which God did by him in the midst of you, as ye yourselves also know. He's like, you saw this, folks. You may have dismissed it, but you saw it. So you know that these things happened. Him being delivered by the determinate counsel, which I have a feeling some of those council members were probably standing there in the midst of this, and they were like, and we see later that they were pricked at their hearts because of this. It says, by the determinate counsel and foreknowledge of God, ye have taken, and by wicked hands have crucified and slain, whom God hath raised from the dead, having loosed the pains of death, because it was not possible that he should be holden of it. So he basically is just making this big statement. Don't dismiss what you're seeing. This is of God. Now hear me. This Jesus that you killed, he was the Christ. He was of God. And God raised him from the dead. We could get really deep into this verse, but we don't have time. We'll do it next week. Having loosed the pains of death. And that was not only upon himself, but now for all of us. That's why we no longer have to fear death. We still die because of the sin penalty, because of our sin nature. But there's there's not that miserable, dreaded day of, and some people, I guess, still do dread the day, but we have hope that that's not the end of us. That's just the point our body shuts down, and we just keep on going because we enter into eternity from that point. And that's and that says, "O death, where is thy sting?" That's a David reference. It says, and this is the big statement. I don't know if we have time to dig into it or not, but it says, "Because it was not possible that he, Jesus, should be holden of it," meaning death. That's a good thought to kind of think about and to close on. So again, apologize for all the technical difficulties, but we'll see you guys next week and leave you with that cliffhanger. And tune in next week at 10 o'clock, and we'll continue going through this. Have a happy 4th.